I hope we all agree that knowledge is a fairly fundamental kind of human endeavor, right? From our earliest days looking for mushrooms in the forest and passing on the knowledge about which mushrooms you really shouldn't eat, we've been discovering and collecting and formalizing knowledge. We do this in sports too, right? Where we try to figure out what teams are most successful and try to get an edge. And of course, and maybe most obviously, we seek knowledge in science by doing experiments, by writing papers, by publishing. And people have studied like knowledge and science, and there's this whole discipline called the science of science, and that's made some interesting discoveries. So we found studying scientific systems that, for example, successful publications tend to be more successful in the future, or that more recent publications tend to get more citations. And also, kind of in contrast to the second thing, that once in a while you have a publication, Einstein had one of these, that sits around for decades, is kind of ahead of its time, or something's going on, no one cites it, and then suddenly, boom, it gets all of these citations. What we don't know is whether all of these kinds of trends are something that's peculiar to science and the like incentives that are at play at science and peer review and all of those things, or whether it's something more profound, more fundamental to like humans coming together and creating knowledge collectively. And so, like John mentioned, I'm a JD from Harvard. I'm doing a PhD at MIT, and so I said, well, let's look at other knowledge systems, somewhere else where we use citations a lot. And one good example of that is the common law, right? Another example, by the way, is patents. And so for the rest of the talk, what we'll be doing is we'll be comparing science, law, and patents, and trying to figure out whether these kinds of trends are unique to science or whether they tell us something deeper. Okay. Now, like I just told you, science, law, and patents, they all rely on citations, right? That's going to be our common denominator. Other than citations, though, I think you'll agree that the systems are very different. If we think about the duration of appointments, right? Scientists, for the most part, are pretty short term. Most scientists just do a PhD and then move on with their lives. A few go on to be professors, but not very many. Judges, meanwhile, the people writing judicial opinions, are appointed for life, literally, right? So this is a completely different kind of time scale and commitment. Inventors are more similar to scientists, right? They kind of come and go as they're making patents. Hierarchies are very different. Science aims to be this egalitarian thing. Everyone can disagree with anybody else. You can't disagree with the Supreme Court. That's not a thing you can do if you're a lower court judge. And the assignment of problems is very different too, right? So judges are randomly assigned problems. Imagine what science would be like if you were randomly assigned papers to rank. So these systems are very different. There are different incentives at play. There are different procedures. And yet, we find them to be very, very similar. So this is just the growth of the number of publications, kind of a trivial thing. All of them, law, science, and technology / patents are growing at this exponential rate. You can see by the x-axis, we have data going back to the 1800s for law, the 1900s for science. So like we've looked at lots and lots of data. Okay, whatever, things grow exponentially. That's not that exciting. It turns out that the number of citations in these systems, as well as the number of references in each publication, has also been growing exponentially. People call this the burden of knowledge. You have to work harder to make new contributions. People get more specialized. Okay, law, science, technology are getting more specialized. We went through the literature. We looked at every pattern we could think of. They are remarkably similar across these three things. So that's exciting, right? Like there's this like universality of knowledge that seems like a cool academic insight, but maybe it's not actually that useful. And so what we set out to do is we said, well, can we try to explain what's going on, right? Can we build a model that actually captures these patterns and maybe lets us look into the future? That's where like fun things happen, right? And so what we came up with was we said, well, maybe all of knowledge exists in this kind of high dimensional sphere, right? All past, present, and future knowledge is on a sphere. And there are little communities of knowledge moving around on these spheres. And if you're close to a community, well, then that community is going to cite you. And if you're far away from everybody else, then you don't get cited. And if we have this kind of weird abstract community citation model, maybe we can predict what's going on. And it turns out that we can. And so this is kind of a visual representation of the Sleeping Beauties that I mentioned earlier, these like papers that stick around for ages. And so what happens is the paper gets published and literally like in this sphere of knowledge that we've collapsed down to 2 dimensions, you can see it's far away from everybody else at the beginning and people are making new publications. So each dot is a new paper. And then suddenly, all of a sudden people are like, oh, wow, this like area is really exciting. Think like AI, right? Think like people have been doing AI research for 50 years, but now everybody's like, swarming to an area. So that's cool. We can kind of identify these disruptions. But I think what is most profound is that we can predict them. And so I want to spend a little bit of time with these graphs. Essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to simulate the network into the future. So we have our little sphere of knowledge. We're placing publications on them. This is all with historical data. And then at some point we say, okay, we're going to cut it off. We're going to predict into the future. And what we want to do is to pick the publications that are going to be most successful. For these graphs, we just said, okay, are the publications in the top quartile? But we can do the top 1% or whatever else you would want. The x-axis is in years, and so for those in the back, it goes from 0 to 20 years. So we're trying to forecast 2 decades into the future. And the top line is the model that we came up with. The two blue lines are other models that don't take this community piece into account, that don't have this kind of spherical model of knowledge. And it turns out that we can get like a 65% accuracy picking the top performers. And we find this exciting because it's not just about science, right? It's something more profound. We're using these insights about how knowledge works, how knowledge disseminates, to really cast into the future and find areas that are going to be hot. And so to leave you with 3 things, what does this kind of work allow us to do? Well, we can suddenly allocate funding completely differently in science, right? Identify areas that are seeming to explode 20 years out and try to support those areas early on. In technology, right, we can forecast which patents are going to be successful, so we can guide R&D investment. And in law, we can guide legal reform efforts, right? Figure out years in advance which kind of challenges are going to come up. What is the Supreme Court going to be ruling on in 20 years' time, and can we intervene with some of those issues now? And I find it kind of on an academic, philosophical level really interesting that one model that essentially is just based on communities and collective collaboration can give rise to all those insights.